And in those days, accounts were relatively thin. The cash flow statement actually used to appear on one page. You didn't have to start on sort of page 40 for the main bit of it and then go to page 84 for the rest of it. Accounting standards were relatively straightforward. Indeed, they didn't really come out that often. I think when I trained at Pricewaterhouse, I think we might have been up to about 10 standards in those days, which made obviously the accounting exams slightly easier than they are now. But the real difference was that the profession treated accounting as an art rather than a science. And what do I mean by that? Well, in those days, financial directors were really encouraged to err on the side of caution. You find the partner turning up at the audit and just saying, I think we just better tuck another £1 million away just in case for a rainy day. We've had a good year. You never know what's going to happen next year. During that time, Argentina went bust. Large exposure for British banks, but you would never have known it looking at the bank's accounts really, because they had these great things called general provisions, which they could build up during times of plenty, and they could use them when times were pretty tough. That is accounting as an art. And then what happened? Well, some bright sparks decided to give up the UK's control over accounting standards. And then someone said, hey, wouldn't it be a much better world to live in if every company in every country had the same accounting standards? Wouldn't that be a fantastic utopia for investors, so they could compare Samsung in Korea with Apple in the US, because they all accounted the same way, and that would make the markets a much easier place to operate in. Unfortunately, that was the death of accounting as I knew it. It's now being taken over by people who think it's a science. And as we know with science, people always want to get to the right answer. Yeah? And in their efforts to do so, they've tried to look at every number on the balance sheet, the P&L, anything that appears in the accounts, and they've tried to assign a way of calculating it. The more complex it is, the happier they are. Yeah? Especially, when they discovered that you could actually have to account for derivatives, they had a huge party, because nothing gets more complex than derivative accounting. It can take up 4 or 5 pages in a report and accounts. Fantastic, yeah? And I really knew that the lunatics had taken over the asylum when I read this article in the paper that the Royal Mail were limiting the number of HSBC report and accounts that could be taken out at any one time by the postman, because they weighed 1 kilogram each. And that was due to all the disclosures that are required. Now, about 4 or 5 years ago, I agreed to become chairman of the CRAG, moment of complete weakness. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the CRAG, that stands for the Company Regulatory and Auditing Group. Now, it doesn't get more exciting than that. But now I find myself in quite a difficult position, because on one hand, I want to have a more joined-up approach, and as a result, since I've become chairman of the CRAG, I've engaged with the heads of the 4 families, aka the 4 accounting professions. David Tweedy, the FRC, and any other organisation which has 3 initials in its name has been round. Because, it's what's turned out to be a forlorn effort by myself, just to express the frustration that investors have with the sheer length and complexity of accounts. And you'd have thought, wouldn't you, with all these fantastic new standards, new regulations, we'd never ever see a misstatement of accounts. You'd never see that RNS appearing on the screen. Yeah? Still happens all the time. Just ask Kate Bleasdale at Healthcare Locums. So, why I think the current system is absolutely crazy and has turned most people off reading accounts. The previous speaker said it was the first port of call. In my view, that's complete rubbish. The first point of call is the website for any investor, potential employee or customer. Because accounts these days are so complex. I mean, before you get to any numbers, you've got to get past pictures of the board, Yeah? You then got 10 pages on the remuneration policy, and then fantastic, you've got the risk factors. Yeah? Risk factors, when they started off in the prospectus, were quite good. They might cover 2 or 3 items. Now, risk factors cover every eventuality that you'd expect to see on an insurance policy. Yeah? Just in case we put it in. I mean, what's an extra page? It doesn't matter, does it? So, but I find that it gives people like myself a massive competitive advantage, because I can actually read a set of report and accounts. Yeah? And I spend a lot of time reading report and accounts. So I must take this opportunity to thank actually all the regulators, standard setters, all those people that gave the power of regulation to Europe for a fantastic 25-year career that I've had at Schroders. I mean, if they kept the accounts really simple, like they were when I joined Schroders, then anyone could do this job. So thanks again. My family really appreciate it. When we're looking at companies, before we're looking to invest, we look at it in a very simplistic way. We're trying to work out the following. We're trying to look at what inputs come into a company and what is affecting those inputs in terms of price, supply, etc. What the company then does with them, and then how it sells them. And we're looking at the various factors that impact that at each stage. We're not concerned with tsunami risk in Japan as a risk factor. Yeah? We're looking at things that are vaguely in the control of the company. And there is a move now, I think, to report and accounts, not to try and cover every eventuality, but keep it simple. But people aren't brave enough. Previous speaker said, people come along and say, have you got an example of this? Rather than saying, you know what, if I was reading the report and accounts myself, this is what I'd like to see, and this is what I'm going to put in. And I don't really care if no one else is doing it that way. I'm going to do it because I think it is more useful. But no one's got the balls to do that, have they, really, unfortunately? When we're looking at numbers in the accounts, we're just trying to ensure that actually the cash turns up in the bank account at some point. You can recognise profit as many times as you want, but unfortunately the customer only tends to pay once. Also, we like to make sure that companies aren't sort of taking expenses out of the P&L and sticking them in the balance sheet and calling them assets, and taking provisions out of the balance sheet and sticking them in the P&L and calling them profits. Art, not a science. The problem is now is that the scientists, after all the damage they've done, still haven't got the answer. So more regulation is coming down the line. And the only way I can see it changing is if Europe falls apart. Greek accounting standards, anyone? I think, they must be great, mustn't they? Do anything you want. And we, in the UK, get back control of the standard setting and ditch this ridiculous experiment to have one set of standards across the world. In the meantime, we are where we are. Complexity of accounting is causing more companies and investors to desert the public markets. At the end of 1999, there were 800 companies in the FT All-Share, excluding investment trusts. As of last night, there were 433. And I just wonder, will it take the death of small and mid-cap companies, for small and mid-cap investing, to make people realise that the burdens they put in place were too onerous? And by the way, after all the money that has been spent trying to get the right answer, it's resulted as in being in a worse place in terms of the report and accounts, trying to show the position of a company for all users, rather than just me, than we were 25 years ago when I joined Schroders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Patricia, I think Andy has set to you a few challenges which I'm sure you're going to want to answer to. Well done.
Okay. I'm delighted to be here, Andy's remarks notwithstanding. I think Matthew set the stage for this discussion in the proper light. He said he put out a good foundation. I've been a member of the International Accounting Standards Board here in London since 2009. And prior to that, I worked on Wall Street for 35 years, primarily as the accounting analyst at Bear Stearns. During that time, my job largely entailed working with sell-side analysts and buy-side analysts to help them understand the information in the financial reports and to use that information in their valuation models to make decisions about which companies they should recommend or which companies they should put into their portfolios. During that period, the markets began to go global. And as they did, I received more and more questions about companies outside of the United States, companies in the UK. Many of the questions, and I got so tired of answering them, were about the qualities of the profits in the UK because the UK didn't amortize goodwill on acquisitions and the US did, and didn't that mean that the US earnings were higher quality? What nonsense. So it became clear to me that an enormous amount of time was being wasted arguing about such nonsensical questions that could be easily resolved by having one accounting standard throughout the world. And at that time, I became involved with the International Accounting Standards Committee, the IASB's predecessor organization. I was part of the analyst delegation on that. And I became passionately converted to the notion that one single set of accounting standards around the globe was going to reduce the cost of capital generally. And I think there are a number of academic studies that now support the notion that international accounting standards have reduced the cost of capital around the globe. The insights that I gained in working in the capital markets for 35 years translate very well, I think, into the role I'm now playing at the IASB. It's clear to me that investors want high-quality, comparable, transparent information on which to base their investment decisions. And it's also clear to me that IFRS provides the best hope of providing that type of information for investors. It's now applied in more than 120 countries around the world. Investors all over the world are familiar with IFRS, even investors in the US. For example, the CFA Institute, the institute that gives the Chartered Financial Analyst designation to analysts, has been testing analysts on IFRS for a decade. So anyone who is a CFA understands IFRS. They're comfortable with it. They feel that it does provide good information on which to begin their valuation of companies. And this has led to the reduction of risk premiums in companies outside of the US. So IFRS has become, I believe, a passport to raise capital on local markets and on a cross-border basis. But in addition to issuing standards for financial statements, the IASB has begun to issue standards on financial reporting. And the first one of those was a non-mandatory standard on management reporting. And the guidance on management commentary that the IASB proposed will produce a useful tool, I believe, for communicating with investors about the key information in the financial statements. It sort of, as Matthew suggested, provides some guidelines, some things to think about. Many of them things, in fact, that Matthew raised in his speech, that you should think about in preparing your management commentary, how to pull that key information out of those lengthy financial statements and highlight them in your management commentary so that your investors have a clear understanding of your story about your company. IFRS also contains a couple of standards that are very important and near and dear to the user community. One of those is on interim reporting. I know managements hate interim reporting, but to investors, interim reporting is key to their decision making. And the IFRS standard on interim reporting, while quite old now, is still, I believe, a very good standard that helps management prepare good interim reports that are useful to the investment community. Another IFRS standard that is near and dear to the heart of many users of financial statements is segment reporting. IFRS 8, which I know was very controversial when it was issued. It has now come up for its promised review, and the IASB today or tomorrow will be putting out a request for information on IFRS 8 segment reporting, asking preparers and users what they think of that standard on segment reporting. We'll take back that commentary and we'll digest it. But I think for you, what might be interesting is what that feedback says to us. Even if the feedback we receive on segment reporting doesn't rise to the level of importance that might cause the board to reopen segment reporting, and let's hope it doesn't. Let's hope we don't have to go through issuing another standard on segment reporting. I think the feedback that we receive, particularly from the user community, may help you to improve your own segment reporting within your own companies within the current framework of IFRS 8. Another area where the IASB has made some important inroads is in IFRS for small and medium-sized enterprises, or IFRS for SMEs. As you know, the IFRS for SMEs is a self-contained standard to meet the needs and capabilities of small and medium-sized entities. And some of you may feel that you yourselves would meet the definition of an SME. And millions of small companies in around 80 jurisdictions are already using IFRS for SMEs. And the IASB has currently undertaken a comprehensive review to enable the board to fine-tune the SME standards. And indeed, yesterday we issued a request for information on the current SME standards to get input from those who are using it and those who would like to use it around the world as to what changes need to be made, if any, to the existing standards. And one of the first things we are asking in that request for information is the scope of the SME standard. As I mentioned, I believe that some of you feel that you should be eligible to use that standard, but as you know, it currently prohibits an entity whose debt or equity instruments are traded in a public market from using IFRS for SMEs. So the first question we are asking in this review is if government and regulatory authorities in each jurisdiction should be free to decide on their own whether some publicly traded entities should be eligible to use IFRS for SMEs in their jurisdictions. So we'll be looking very carefully at the answers we receive to that, and then the board will make decisions about what to do in the future with the SME standard. As Matthew mentioned, we have 4 big projects on our agenda currently: revenue, leases, financial instruments, and insurance. 3 of those, revenue, leases, and financial instruments, are convergence projects with the FASB. Insurance is being done jointly with the FASB, although it doesn't come under the umbrella of our official convergence agenda. We're hoping to have all of those standards done by next year, mid next year. It's going to be difficult. Working with the FASB is time-consuming. Our board has 15 members, their board has 7 members, so it's 22 people now you have to get to agree instead of just 15 or 16. So you can imagine the complexity of trying to do a converged standard. But we're making progress, and we're currently considering the feedback on our second exposure draft on revenue, and we plan to finalize that in the first quarter of 2013. For most entities, we don't think that it's going to result in any change to revenue recognition practices. There are a few, however, where it may result in significant changes. The telecoms come to mind, where there will be more revenue recognized sooner for the telecoms. Wrap it up? Okay. So these projects will be done, and then we will enter a period of calm. It'll be calm for you, but not for our board. It's clear from our agenda consultation that what our constituents want us to work on is our conceptual framework, particularly presentation, figure out what OCI is really meant to be, and work on a disclosure framework, and that should keep us busy probably for the next 5 or 6 years, so there won't be much coming out to bother you other than improvements that will need to be done in the short term. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Sorry to cut you a little short there. We've had a really good debate there and 2 distinct points of view. What I'd like to do, conscious of time, is just take any questions. If there is more than 1 or 2 questions, let's take them as a group and then give the panel a chance to reply. I'm sure there will be some questions on this subject, because it's and I'll also, well, those of you maybe don't have a question, say one thing about the QCA's activities here. I was part of a group that QCA has organised to actually go and meet the ISB on the subject of reporting and how it impacts on small and mid-cap companies, and I really do advise you as a finance director who doesn't get very involved in the whole standard setting process. What that told me was the ISB actually is listening, and as Patricia mentioned, there are exposure drafts and other consultations out there that we as a group, as a membership, should really make sure we provide our views on. We have lots of advisors who help do that, but I know that with Tim and the QCA team that we'll welcome any of your views on any of the subjects that have been raised today in terms of helping QCA's response to them. Are there any questions from the floor? If you have the microphone in the middle there, please. You can just say who you are as well, that's always helpful.
Hi, Colin Glass again. Does the panel think that the amount of time that small, and I stress small, market cap companies have to spend on such things as IFRS, share-based payments and other accounting standards which seem to be irrelevant to these small companies, do they think it's out of proportion to the value that anyone gets out of it, and is incredibly costly in time, effort and money?
Thank you, Colin. Let's just take, if there are other questions, I just want to take them as a group. Down here in front of me.
So my company, as you may remember, it's Stephen Streeter from Forbidden Technologies. It's a small technology company, and we have adopted IFRS for various technical reasons. And what I was wondering was whether, I mean, I'm less worried about the international scope of it, but we're a small technology company, and most small technology companies are not quoted anywhere in the world. So it's not really, I would have thought, a priority to make your standards work well with a small technology company. And the gentleman just here has mentioned, for example, share-based payments, option-based payments. They don't seem to be that relevant to us. And so is the issue slightly perhaps that specific sectors like the high-growth technology sector may not be handled very effectively by IFRS, and the rigidity of the rules, the art versus science that was mentioned earlier, means that the rigidity of the rules doesn't allow us to perhaps give as fair a view as we would like about the progress of the company.
Thank you. So we have two questions over, one about time, the other is rigidity of rules. There are two people on that table, so we'll take both of your questions and then we'll give the panel a chance to answer them all.
I'm an auditor from Baker Tilly, Jonathan Lowe. I think the wording comes down to the word should in any financial reporting. Should, materiality. It's very difficult for most preparers to even consider. And how you consider taking out things like share-based payments. One person's materiality is another person's material. I would just go a step further than what was said on the left. Do you consider high-tech businesses to be relevant? Are any businesses relevant that isn't a bank? As most of IFRS is actually leaning towards what banks are putting on their balance sheets, is there actually a point of scoping out a vast greater number of businesses?
Okay, thank you.
Peter Simmons from Dot Digital Group. Question about accounting for acquisitions with deferred consideration. I don't know if anybody else has yet tried to do one and then actually report the results of it when the figure that you end up paying isn't the number that you guessed 2 years previously. But I now spend most of my time when I meet analysts trying to explain to them what all these adjustments are in my accounts, and I'd quite like other people's views on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll try, there's 4 questions there, we'll take as a group, get each of you to give a brief answer. Actually, let me restructure that. Let's take the question, I think the first 2 kind of went together, which is really, is the time that needs to be devoted to producing and complying with the standards out of proportion as far as the small or medium sized companies are concerned? And should there be specific, more thought given to specific sectors such as technology and the relevance of the standards to those? Can I start with Matthew at the end there, and we'll work backwards.
Addressing the point on time spent by small cap companies being out of proportion, I think you've actually highlighted a very serious issue. As I said in my talk, I would love the IASB to actually think small first and actually try and scope a lot of small and mid-cap companies out of some of the requirements and actually properly assess some of the cost-benefit analysis. And I think they would find that particularly at the smaller end of the market, the costs vastly outweigh the benefits. In terms of the rigidity of the rules and the point you made about fast-growing technology companies, I don't know whether you're adopting full IFRS or IFRS for SMEs. I presume it's full IFRS in a UK context. I think you have a point. IFRS is designed for the largest companies around the globe. And because of that, it is not particularly fleet of foot for dealing with a small and fast-growing business. Okay. And I accept you have a very real problem there.
Matthew. Patricia?
Well, I appreciate the problem that small public companies have in keeping up with these standards, but my experience when I worked on Wall Street was that public companies in the US had to follow US GAAP, and there's a whole lot more US GAAP than there is IFRS. And to go public, they had to follow the whole bag load of it. And they found it worthwhile because they didn't want to stay small forever. And the only way you're going to grow is to attract capital. And to attract capital, you have to be in the same league with the big guys. And so while it's time-consuming and costly and painful while you're small, it will pay off in the end because it will help you grow. That's my personal belief. And so the thought I know on the board is, and people say that the standards were set for the largest companies in the world. I don't think they were. They were set for public markets, and I don't think the size of companies ever really factored into the thought. Remember, I was on the IASC, which is where the IAS standards came from, and when that board was setting those standards, nobody had to follow them. So they were just for companies in general with the hopes that companies would want to follow them. And so they weren't really tailored for big companies, they were just tailored for companies in general. So the board's philosophy is that if you don't have stock-based compensation, you shouldn't even read that standard. It's a separate standard. Why even become familiar with it? But if you do have stock-based compensation, you should be looking at it, because one of the things that became clear when the standard went into effect was that a lot of companies didn't realize how much of their company they were giving away. So my experience, again, coming from Wall Street, was that what wasn't accounted for wasn't managed. And so these standards may seem onerous and they may not seem applicable to you. And if they aren't applicable to you, just put it aside and go on. If you don't have derivatives, yeah, there's a lot of literature on derivatives, and derivatives accounting is difficult. But if you don't have any, don't pay any attention to it. Don't worry about it.
Thank you, Patricia. Andy?
Well, I have some sympathy, obviously, with your view, but that's what you've signed up for. That's what the regulators have brought in. And the only option is just sell yourself.
It's as gloomy as that, is it? Okay. I think we're going to call time on the hours. I think the point on acquisition accounting is noted. I personally feel a great deal of sympathy with that one, having just have to implement that in our company. So, but we are drawing to a close now, and thank you all. So we could thank the panel for their most stimulating contributions. That's been very, very
Yeah.